Okay, thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. I've been introduced already, so I will keep it short and go very quickly to the main core of this webinar today, and I'm very happy to talk about it. Perhaps a few more words about myself. I'm actually trained as a scientist. I studied theoretical physics, and like many people in my profession, once they take a departure from academia and have to make a life somehow, ended up in consulting. And that was a good bunch of years ago. But what I did find very early on my first assignments or projects is a reality that I would assume many, if not all of you know, that in organizations we have these wonderful ideas, we have these very worthy causes often, change projects or something that teams or organizations try to create, but very often the reality is that this just doesn't quite come about. So I got more and more curious as to why does change fail, for instance, and the common piece of knowledge here that many people I met know is, well, it's not necessarily for the lack of technical expertise, it's often for a difficulty to coordinate the human beings who are part of it. And intrigued by that, I started to do more and more work in terms of my own training and development. So as Ali said, I became a licensed therapist and a mediator because I really found myself very intrigued by the various factors that humans really bring to their work. So from there, let's just move on to the team environment, which is really something that I have been focusing on for probably the last 8 years or so, predominantly doing work in this area. I titled the webinar, What Separates High-Performing from Average-Performing Teams? Because one of the findings that my business partner and I have, and when we compare notes with fellow consultants in our area, they have very similar impressions, is that most of the time when we are working with organizations, when someone comes and hires us, most of the time we meet not poorly working dysfunctional teams, and also not high-performing teams. Most of the time we meet average-performing teams. They're doing okay. There is no strong pain that is really pushing the organizations to really look more thoroughly. It's kind of going along well, but people have a sense that somehow, and they would report so that by themselves, that somehow they are not really living up to the potential, the effectiveness, the pace that they could. And that is a starting point for our conversation. And so what I've been wondering for quite a while is, it is not the lack of knowledge. The concept of teamwork has been around for such a long time that there's a tremendous amount of social and organizational research as to what makes good teams better, what separates the high-performing teams from the not-so-high-performing teams. So if it's not the lack of knowledge, what's really getting in the way? And that was increasingly really something that I try to explore. And that will be also something I'm predominantly going to talk about today. So let's start off, and unfortunately we're not in the same room. Sometimes I do that and I just ask people to give me show of hands. The MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has a human performance laboratory, and they came up with little cards that people wore around on a band around their neck, and those cards would not record what people said. They would simply measure the volume of the voice, whether people who talked to one another, whether they faced each other, how much people were moving, whether someone left the room or not, or for how long they were gone. So they really only took movement data, and they tried to look for pattern that separated high-performing from low-performing teams. And so my first question to you is, do you think the following is possible? What this team around Alex Pentland did is they went globally to business plan contests and looked at the opening ceremonies or at when people met for dinner the night before. They just looked at the behaviors that those contestant teams exhibited, and they tried to predict who's going to win the business contest, or the business plan contest. Not knowing anything about those teams, they just said, okay, based on our idea of the motion patterns and the behavioral patterns of high-performing teams, let's just see if we can predict who's going to win. So my first question to you is, do you think that they will have a significant, that their prediction is not just chance? So if you were in the room with me, I would ask you to raise your hand right now. But do you think, is that possible, yes or no, in a reasonably statistically relevant way? And what I do find is that a lot of people say, yeah, you can possibly do that. But then let's ask the next question. Do you think it's possible to predict the winning team without ever hearing or reading anything of the content that they're going to present, anything about what their actual business idea is? And this is when I find people have a more startled and puzzled look in their face. And part of what those teams around Alex Pentland did is they looked into what they call their three categories. They call it energy, engagement, and exploration. Basically, how team members, how individuals of a team contribute to a team as a whole, and the amount of energy they bring to it, how team members communicate with one another, they call that engagement, and how team members communicate with, not team members, how teams communicate with other teams. So those are the main areas that they look into to make their predictions. And my final question is, do you believe they can predict with 87% accuracy who's going to win the business contest, not knowing anything about their actual content? And indeed they can, and that to me is extraordinary, and actually to a lot of people I present this to who haven't read the article or are not familiar with this work. So it really shows us, A, that we have some very solid ideas that have nothing to do with the technical expertise that people bring to their teams about what enables high performance or not, and I will show you more about this material here. So that's one thing. The next question I want to put out is, and I'm putting it as a question again, is your game golf or basketball? And the question here really is, golf is something that someone wins who is just the best player. The golf player doesn't need a team, but that's very different for basketball. Basketball is a team sport, and not necessarily the team that has the strongest individual player is going to win the sport. There's a whole degree of interdependence in it, and that is exactly the reality that most teams, I would argue, are in these days. So imagine a team whose team members are open with one another, passionately debate important issues, and commit to clear decisions even if they initially disagree. They call each other out when their behaviors or performance needs correction, and they focus their attention on the collective good of the organization. They are not just trying to maximize the good for their own function or for themselves. So imagine that, and let's call them Team A. And now imagine Team B, whose members are guarded and less than honest with one another. They hold back during difficult conversations, they feign commitment, and they hesitate to call one another on unproductive behaviors. Often, they pursue their own agenda rather than those of the greater organization. So we have Team A, we have Team B, and now if we could have a dialogue, the question would be, what kind of advantage really would the first team have over the other? And how much time and energy would it be worth investing it to make that advantage a reality? And that is really the key question. I have yet to meet someone who thinks Team B would be better off. Everyone I've talked to is in agreement that Team A represents the much more powerful ideal of collaboration and is more likely to deliver something that's extraordinary and high performing. But the big question is how to get there. And I will not wait until the end of this webinar to really give you my probably most important takeaway why I personally believe that most teams are average performing and not high performing. The answer is pretty simple. It's not the lack of knowledge. It is an extraordinary amount of work that's required to get from average performing to high performing, and most people do not invest a sufficient amount of time and energy to really significantly get into the high performance zone. It's not an easy game. There are extreme rewards and merits to reap from it, but no one gets it for free. Sometimes startups or some teams magically have the luck and the opportunity to just have the right chemistry, but for the reality of most large organizations where people come on and off of teams, the reality is it takes work, and it takes quite a bit of work, not just like an annual team retreat once a year. So there is a huge advantage here. What does it take to make it happen? And why are not more organizations trying to reap those advantages? Well, there are a number of answers to this, and I would just want to give you 3 reasons. One is, obviously the workforce has changed, and that is a reality that, as Ali said, I've worked on 4 continents, and I find that is true really across the globe where I have worked, that all of a sudden we have a much more heterogeneous workforce where people have multicultural backgrounds. They may have very strong ethnic or cultural roots in a particular area where they grew up, but they were trained or educated in another part of the world. They're exposed to cultural diversity, which is at this stage, at no point in human history have we been exposed to more cultural diversity than now. So we have a multi-generational workforce. People bring different values and perspectives, and what we want in our teams are actually really smart people who do have opinions. So all of a sudden we have a workforce that's also much harder to manage, and it takes much more skill to really, on the human or interpersonal side, to really get those individuals together and work for an overarching goal. The second reason is that the workplace really isn't a place anymore. I talk to people who would love to have their favorite colleagues in the same room, if not at least on the same floor in the same building, so they can just walk across the corridor and ask a question to someone or just run a thought by a trusted friend or colleague. But the reality is that a lot of us really don't necessarily have physical presence anymore. Most of us still do. Some of us actually do not have any physical presence at all anymore. Right now this webinar is a great example. We haven't met at all, and we're not in the same room. So we've moved from physical presence to technological presence, whereby people work more from home, they travel more, they dial in their phone conferences. It's a whole different level of relating that really challenges us in the way we have traditionally established trust in our relationships. And we also have a decentralized contribution now of these highly autonomous and specialized experts that I just mentioned in the slide prior. They're really coming from, they may have different backgrounds, they may sit in different functions, they may come from a matrix organization and just hop on board for a particular project. All of that really creates a big challenge of what space means. And why is that a problem? What I do find is that the conflict that will always inevitably happen sooner or later in any kind of project, and there's nothing wrong about conflict for the most part, depending on the kind of conflict, but most of us aren't comfortable with conflict. And as we are not on the same floor anymore, we may not have enough trust established in our relationships. It's a lot easier to sweep conflict under the rug if I never meet someone. And it's very tempting to do so if all I have is twice a year an in-person meeting that I just say, I don't really want to open this can of worms. So the result, though, is that there is a lot of important conflict that doesn't get addressed, and it starts to work against high performance on teams. The third reason, which is a whole webinar on its own, so I'm not actually doing a slide on this, has to do with complexity. The IBM, I don't know if some of you are familiar with their studies. Every year they do a global CEO or global CFO study. You can download it from IBM for free. They're really very, very insightful. And one of the things 2 years ago, the main theme that came out from the global CEO study was complexity. Most CEOs said that managing complexity is a defining challenge for their business success. So obviously also dealing with that rising level of complexity is something that challenges high performance on teams. So what is different? When we think about collaboration, and this is maybe a funny remark, but actually it also made me somewhat sad when I heard it, and I haven't heard it once. Sometimes when I present material like this, that people come up to me and say, you know what, like if I had to define collaboration, or if I had to define my experience of collaboration, it would be not the reality of Team A. It would be, we throw a number of people in the same room in our organization. We say, oh, you have to work together, and everyone's got to do what the boss expects them to do. That's collaboration. And I would argue, well, that's a sad reality or version of collaboration. But in the past, collaboration was mostly, and I would call that coordination of effort. I have a big field, it needs to get harvested. One person is not going to do it in time, so I need more people. Everyone gets a part of the field and the scimitar to just do it, and they get it done. Not a very high degree of interdependence, if any at all. With the Industrial Revolution, that started to change somewhat, but not still. There are still clearly defined manufacturing processes. People have well-defined tasks, and their job is to kind of get the job done to do this particular task. It was a more automated and industrialized process, but still mostly coordination of effort. But that has radically changed now. So what you're looking at, for instance, is a piece of flexible e-paper that needs very little energy. You can read it outside in the sun. You can bend it as much as you want. It doesn't tear. So it's a very attractive product. How did we get there? It wasn't one player. It was several players. As a matter of fact, in this case, it was Hewlett-Packard's innovation labs. They had an idea, but they needed much more knowledge they didn't have in-house about polymers, so they went to a state university, but they didn't have the experience with the production process to get those materials done, so they ended up going to DuPont. And all of these, all of a sudden, had to work together, and without that collaboration, this product would have never really made it. So that is the large scale, but I think for a lot of teams, the need to really bring different players together and combine the best of their knowledge and experience is pretty much the same challenge. So what has changed is that we have moved from information value to connection value. It's not just that we need to know, but we also have to be able to connect the knowledge. And without enough conversation among team members, that connection is not going to happen. We have also moved really from very fixed structures. When you think about large organizations in the past, they've been very hierarchical, they've been vertically organized. This is changing because those structures are also very slow to adapt to change. What we do have now are much more fluid structures. Teams come together and disband. Organizations even reorganize according to different needs. So all of a sudden, our structural setup is different. And again, that's all creates difficulty to manage that. And we've also gone from a command and control culture in many places, and certainly in most, if not all of the successful places, to a collaborate and control structure, because managing just by means of formal power and authority does not get you the creative and discretionary input from your team members. So this is a new reality, and we have to learn to manage it. It's a very difficult and complex reality. But what is happening in our organizations? Well, most places I'm coming to have one focus and one big pressure point, and that is they have to deliver results, and those results better get delivered today, if not yesterday. There is an immense pressure to deliver, and there is an immense pressure to deliver ever more with ever less. So that's a reality that most organizations face. It does put people in the crisis mentality. Often it's one thing if that happens once or twice, but for most organizations it's an ongoing reality. That crisis mentality makes it even, puts even more emphasis on outcomes. Who's doing what by when? Let's get it done. People start to do individual heroics where they say, okay, I know how to cut a corner, I can do it, I don't want to talk to you because that conversation takes too long, I'll just create some results here and we work with it. But that causes poor alignment, more delays, more interruptions, which increases the pressure. So this is a very vicious cycle that I find a lot of places are in. It's really hard to break it. It's a lot easier to talk about it. But I want to be respectful of how hard it indeed is to address that differently. So there are conversations that we often see and that we are asked to come in on is, well, how do we improve getting more results out? That's where the team's focus is or leadership's focus is. But the conversation people really need to have more are what we call the how conversations, not the who does what by when, but what are our relationships like? Is there any conflict we haven't been addressing? Who needs what from when? If I'm under stress, what can you do to help me come out of my stress behavior, because usually our stress behavior doesn't bring out the best of us. How do I want to be communicated? How do you want me to make my points so that you understand it best? Those are conversations that in our fast-paced fast-paced work environments we're not having enough of, and they do take a toll on how high-performing teams can be. So we need more of that. Let's look at the evidence. So we really went into we did a proprietary piece of research, and we also worked with basically studying various surveys and research data from organizational psychology research, and looked at companies, and these are just a few. For instance, take Pixar, which I assume a lot of you are familiar with, Pixar Studios. What makes it possible that a small studio like that really produces over and over and over again a movie that is globally successful to an international audience, to adults and children alike? Not a one-off chance product, but they did it over and over and over again with Toy Stories and Finding Nemo, and they're just a whole bunch of movies. So there's clearly something that some of these companies are doing, and so we were asking, what is it that supports creativity and breakthrough thinking? What supports operational excellence? Because clearly still at the end of the day there has to be a result. And then what turns team members into team players? So let's start with Google. Google had a very particular challenge because obviously they're a bunch of engineers. They have a very strong engineering cultures with very strong individuals who do not appreciate management. Surprise perhaps, but perhaps not. They want to get work done because they're engineers, and they think a manager is just someone who is overhead in an organization, and ideally these guys shouldn't even exist. So they thought about what can we do to build a better boss, and they literally did what they do best. They took their analytics teams and they mined through thousands of performance reviews, 360 assessments of their bosses, interviews from recruitment processes, interviews when people left their job or got fired. They just went through all of this and they tried to see, like, what's the magic bullet here? Like, what is it that makes the best boss? They didn't find it. What they did find are actually 8 different characteristics, but most of them, and that is what I found remarkable and why I created the slide here, have to do with people-centered skills. And the reason why I introduced it into a team presentation here is because I do think that this is not just true for managers, it's also true for team members. Remember, this is about how do team members become team players. What it takes is active listening, an interest in coaching others, having an idea of what their career development goals are and supporting them, and being interested also in my colleagues' success and in their well-being. These are characteristics that do not sound very results-oriented, but they make a huge difference and actually at the core of what distinguished the most successful managers in Google from those who were good but not great. Another piece of research that I found extraordinary is this is a group, they interviewed, I think, about 10,000 people over 6 months, every workday. At the end of the day, they had to say, was that a good day or was that a bad day? And then the follow-up question was, well, why? What made it a good day or what made it a bad day? And the extraordinary, because I was really extremely surprised to see 76%. What they found is the most important factor that people report creates a sense of a good day for them is that they make progress. People come to work because they want to get a job done. They're not coming to work to sing Kumbaya, so sometimes that's a big relief for some of the people I'm presenting to, because they wonder, like, so where is this going? Is this just about having talking circles? So people want to get a job done, and if they feel they make progress towards whatever the defined goal is, they feel this is a good day. On a bad day, it's nearly the reverse. They feel there are setbacks. The second column, by the way, means actions of support directed towards the project, and the last smallest column means actions of support directed towards the person. So it's not that people are emotionally needy. They want to get the job done and they want to see action that supports the project. But why does that matter? It matters because whether people collaborate or not is ultimately something we cannot mandate. So this is another thing that I find myself say over and over again, because it's really important to appreciate that. It's whether people collaborate or not is a decision, and that decision, like any decision, because we are not rational decision makers, we try to believe we're rational decision makers, but there's a lot of interesting research that demonstrates how strongly emotions are part of our decision-making process. people will not make that choice to collaborate if they don't feel they're part of an emotionally supportive environment in which they have a sense of flow. So it really matters to create an environment that makes progress, and then it matters to create an environment that supports really the project itself. That is something that matters. So the bottom line here still is that at the end of the day, we have to organize work in a way that gives people a sense of progress. This is kind of like a very fundamental reality, and at no point is that something we must forget. Back to the Alex Pentland team. So you saw one part of the slide. So one thing, and this is a very actionable thing, and I do find when I'm sometimes invited to just sit in on a team to observe team dynamic, it's probably one of the things I pay attention to the most is, do people talk and listen in equal measure? If there is a team where that is happening, it's one of the strongest correlated predictors for high team performance. Teams where one or few people dominate conversations and everyone else is basically shutting up, that is not a good sign, and that is something that people can very easily start creating some discipline around. So everyone talks about an equal measure. Team members face one another. There is energy and in their gestures and emotions. Okay, members connect directly. So this is another classic, and I'm sure you've seen that, where let's say Jim has a problem with Jane, but instead of going to Jane and say, here's something that's not working for me, let's try to work this out, Jim is going to Jane's boss or to some colleagues or some people that Jane is supervising and tells them how terrible Jane is. That's sometimes called triangulation. Rather than dealing with one another on a one-on-one basis, I'm going to a third party to vent my anger there. Very corrosive, very human, but very corrosive, and at the end of the day does create an environment in which conflict is not dealt with directly, but also leadership is really undermining its own authority in the face of the people they are leading. It's probably one of the worst things that can happen to organizations, but happens a lot, unfortunately. Also, members carry back channel conversations and side conversations back to their team. Another hugely important piece, because not everything needs to get resolved within the team, but if I start consulting with third parties or other functions, the point is that I bring that knowledge back to my team so we can start using that as a stepping stone for an improved discussion, and I'm not keeping that to myself. So, so those back channel conversations and making a conscious effort, that's the fifth point, to get outsiders' point of view into the conversation. So we're not just talking, basically not just having groupthink. Those are huge predictors. You can look up this article, can download it at HBR. It's a very worthy read, and it probably gives you a lot of actionable ideas about what can be done. So another thing I want to add here is, because this is another classic, let's brainstorm. And friendly or high-performing teams aren't teams that have a fast sense of harmony. This is really important. They often have quite fierce conflict, but they have the ability to do that constructively. So there is a lot of research on brainstorming, and while this is a very popular concept and it can be a very powerful concept in most places would be better off asking people individually to write up their ideas, because they found that when they do that and then take those individually generated ideas together, that's actually, it creates more and better ideas than group-based brainstorming. But the point here is, group-based brainstorming is better if people have the ability to deal with constructive criticism and they do have a structured debate. So there is more to say about what that looks like, but for instance, for those of you who do take notes during that conversation or that webinar here, if you just look up, for instance, dialogue versus debate online, you get a lot of ideas. The key here really is that brainstorming and building on each other's ideas needs some structure. It's not something that people just know how to do best. So there are a few tactics that also seem commonsensical but very important, and again extremely actionable. Focus on facts, particularly as team leaders. Make sure that if the conversation veers away from facts and people are starting to just give each other interpretations, that is something that needs to get curbed. Multiply alternatives. Do not try to make a decision too early. Again, most of the time I find actually sadly that teams they finally have one idea, and then it's all about, well, this is a good idea, I want to do it, and someone else says, no, I don't think it's a good idea, I don't want to do it. And then they get stuck in that fight, rather than saying, before we even decide, let's come up with at least 2 or 3 alternatives and decide what's good or bad about each one of them. Common goals, again, sounds perhaps like a classic. I've seen writing on teamwork and team concepts from the 70s that already has been emphasizing how important it is. A common goal, and I think this is the important piece here, is something that creates a common destiny for everyone on the team. If you and I are on the team, it is impossible for me to win if you lose. And the reality is that in a lot of places, particularly when I do leadership team developments, that is not true, that people have functional infighting, that if I'm heading the marketing function and someone else is heading the sales function, that somehow I try to get one up on my colleague, and that does not create cohesive leadership teams. So create a common goal is extremely important. And then balance power structure, so stay away from formal use of formal power. I've talked about that. And seek consensus with qualification. I'll say more about that in the moment, but basically it means we're trying to always try to make a decision that's consensus-based, but of course that's not always possible. There's got to be clarity about when the discussion has to be ended, and then also by whom. Often it might be the person with the most formal power in the room or who has the budget responsibility, but there's got to be clarity about it, and I do find that most places have discussions that go on for way too long. Supporting the evolution of collaboration. This is a classic. If you look at the quote there, it's the source, it's 1981, and the reason why I inject that, this is, it's a big question that I'm sometimes asked. What do you do with people who don't play nice? Do you collaborate with a non-collaborator, so to speak? And this is a classic from game theory, where a very standard scenario in game theory, it's called the prisoner's dilemma, has been played with different strategies. Like if someone basically is not collaborating, but you're collaborating, how do you respond to it? Do you just continue to collaborate and hope the person gets the message? Do you strike back right away? Do you wait out twice, or do you think 3 strikes? So what are the best ways of doing this? And it really can be formalized. There have been, there's a lot of theory. You can run computer simulations. And the long story short is that the very classic that some of us learn literally in kindergarten is tit for tat. And it is the most effective strategy in game theory. And it basically means you try to play nice, but if someone doesn't, you don't wait. You just immediately respond to someone who breaks the rules of collaboration. And what I do find in most organizations is that particularly leaders, but that's also true for team members, they wait too long if they have a person on the team who creates dysfunctional influences or behaviors, and then there is an increased impression for that person that they can get away with it, and that really it just slows down high performance very, very quickly. So the long story short here is be clear about the rules of collaboration. If someone breaks it, they have to be called out right away. And if they then go back to collaboration and they follow the team rules or team principles or whatever you have agreed upon, great, you just move on, no need to dwell on it. But there has to be an immediate response. And if they still break the rules, then there has to be a more severe follow-up, because if your behavior isn't consistent, they will not adapt accordingly. So that's a classic, and it really is very, very important. I have one more, and then I actually come to the tool that I hope some of you have taken. That is one phrase that I remember I probably came across it pretty much in the first year of my as a consulting junior. It's a classic: disagree and commit. I hear that a lot. People are very, I don't know, it's a great concept, it's wonderful, and it's really very, very important. The reality is that in a number of places I'm seeing, people aren't disagreeing and commit, they're just saying yes and then they despair. Or they say yes, but then they go back to their team and say, can you believe what they, even though they were part of the decision-making process, what my colleagues or my boss are thinking. They're basically throwing their leadership team under the bus in front of their function. So disagree and commit, it's something, it sounds great, it's easier said than done. And the main part, and this is what I bolded here in text, is unless people have a sense that there was a fair and transparent decision-making process that resulted in the scenario that I actually didn't like, disagreeing and committing won't work. It's just words. It's just paper. It's hard enough already to disagree and commit if I don't get what I wanted. But the very least that I need to see is that there was a fair and transparent decision-making process, that I felt my option, my scenario, my preference was explored as much as the winning scenario, and that I understand why ultimately the decision fell the way it did. If I don't do it, disagree and commit is not going to happen. And the result here and the repercussion for a lot of teams is really to go back and think about some of their more key decision-making processes and be very honest and say, you know, how well do we organize our decision processes here? Are we clear about those rules? Do we have that transparency and fairness in it so that those of us who don't get their preferred scenario will be able to sell a decision to their organization? And that alone can be a nice workshop or a nice afternoon with a leadership team to really talk about it, because it's a very, very important part. So let's look at those aspects. And again, those of you, we put all this research and we broke out 12 key aspects. Basically, we took a research partner who has a very interesting way to survey people, because what they do is they're not just asking, you know, frequency or tell me on a scale from 1 to 5, do you like it a lot or do you not like it? They have a survey methodology that's really based on the more recent emotional or neuroscience insights, and so they basically combine rational and emotional feedback. Because I already said that most decisions, all decisions, are rational as much as emotional. So we basically ask people, imagine an ideal experience of collaboration on a team, and then later we ask them, think about your actual experience of collaboration on a team, and then for each of these scenarios, you know, what kind of feelings are coming up. So we ask about intensity to normalize the response that we have. What kind of feeling is it? Have you been feeling this already or not? So this again allows us to normalize the emotional load, the importance that people give to this particular point. And then what made you feel this way? This really helps us understand more what the associated reasons are. And we took that research, and I can't go into much of it, but what I do want to say is the interesting piece is it brought out the same thing that we saw on the slide earlier. People want to make progress. So the most important thing that people said, on their ideal team, they get the job done. If they don't get the job done, it's not an ideal team. And of course, teams come together to pursue some particular goal. But the next two areas that came up for them, and there was a huge difference in terms of emotional satisfaction with their actual and their ideal scenario, had to do with the culture of the team and with how much connection or cohesion they had among team members. So this is exactly then where I want to go right now. So let's look at those 12 areas, and I broke them out into needed to play well, and needed to win. And just a word of warning, this is not a magic bullet either, this framework. I'm not saying that this is a framework that replaces all other frameworks out there. I don't think that such a thing exists, but it will give you a very, very powerful way to quickly assess, particularly if you have a already average performing team, where you should start your conversation to increase the level of high performance. So needed to play clearly, if people need to share information openly, and there has to be clarity of roles and responsibilities. I'll say more about all these things in a moment. Clear roles and responsibilities, again, it's been a classic for decades, and again, and perhaps because organizations are often changing so quickly, or people are changing, I do find that in far too many places that there isn't enough clarity. Needed to play well. So balancing the focus on task and relationship, providing personal information, addressing conflict timely, making time to reflect how work gets done, avoiding use of formal power, and discussing decision norms and roles. And then needed to excel, ensuring all voices are heard, so that very much goes back to the Alex Pentland work, for instance, and there are others. Managing different thinking styles, focusing on possibility and building on each other's ideas. So let's look a little bit at this. So at this stage, we have over 1,000 people who have taken our assessment. We started to do this about a year ago, and by all means, please do it. I'm very happy to have more data. And the one thing, so you think about a particular team and you say 50% basically means we don't gain from it, we don't lose from it, there is no pain, no gain, that's kind of neutral. 100% means we're doing it so well, it's impossible to do it better, and even if we did, we wouldn't get more of it. And 0% means this is so terrible, this is seriously hurting and damaging the team. And so we asked people to rate their team experience for these 12 characteristics, and then we also asked them on a scale from 1 to 5, how is your team performing? Very poorly, poorly, gets the job done, we're great, we're absolutely excellent. And the first thing you notice here is, so the green line is the high-performing team, those who considered their teams actually high-performing. So what you do see is the lower the team performance level is, obviously the less well those characteristics are being served on those respective teams, so maybe no surprise there. What I also found amazing is, and again that's kind of going back to Google, there is no one magic bullet. It's not that one of these characteristics stands out or two. It's really, you've got to get them all right, and this is another challenge of building high-performance teams. You can't just focus on one thing. It's a little bit of an art and a science where different things have to come into play at the right time. But clearly high-performance teams do this a lot better than low-performing teams. The area in which, regardless of performance level, all teams had the lowest scores actually had to do with getting clarity to their decision norms. So that is actually, just on a side note, something I find interesting, but I'll not go into it for the sake of the time that we've got. What I also found interesting is that on high-performing teams, the providing personal information, that they actually feel they could do this a little bit more. Perhaps at least they're not utilizing it as a performance booster as well as they do the other areas. On low-performing teams, though, people do that. You see, there's when you look at the red line there, it's actually a little peak and not a bump. So I do find that in a lot of low-performing teams, people share more personal information, but it doesn't help with the performance. It's really starting to be more of a gossiping or just basically not work-related conversations. So that's another thing. It's usually a bad indicator if that happens. So let's go super quickly through these. If you take the assessment, if you register, you can actually read up much more about each of these. Task and relationship, what I just want to say there is there's a strong cultural preference. Obviously, in some cultures, I'm personally from Germany, and in Germany, the cultural preference is very much on task. You focus on what needs to get done, and as you work together, you form a relationship. In other areas, the Middle East, for instance, Southern or South America, it's pretty much different, where the importance of establishing a relationship and having a sense who the people are with whom I'm dealing is so important that unless I have that, I don't really even want to start doing some kind of work together. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter where I start as long as that cycle is happening. Our relationship gets stronger. It helps us focus on work and to create nice outcomes because we have that shared experience of creating good work. Our relationship gets stronger. Wherever I start jumping into that circle doesn't quite matter. What does matter is that I have the wherewithal to realize what is needed. And I do find that on high-performance teams, people actually have the emotional and social awareness to realize, do we need more focus on the task or do we need more focus on the relationship? So back to my one slide, do we need more of a what conversation or do we need more of a how conversation? So they do that well. Sharing information openly, again, one of the big breaks, and particularly in larger organizations, is resource hoarding, and that isn't just about money or paper or whatnot. It's also about information. and again, if people don't share information openly, it will be very hard to have transparent and fair decision-making processes, and then people can't really disagree and commit. So that's why we decided to put it up here as another characteristic. Providing personal information. The point here is not necessarily to, let you know about like the favorite name of my favorite cat when I was a child, or to draw you in and to convince you about what a wonderful person I am. The point here is that every human being, for the most part, every human being does not prefer conflict. And if we have trust, if we have a sense of who we are and what drives us, it's not only encourages us to have the disagreement and to negotiate our needs more honestly and more transparently, it also gives us more respect for where the other person is coming from, and that again really creates team cohesion, and that creates team performance. Building on each other's ideas, a classic when you just, and please by all means do that exercise if you sit in on a team or even observe your own teams. Is it when you have a team discussion, is it basically if you have 5 people, person A says, oh, let's do this, and then the next person says, oh, let's do that, and then the third person says, no, let's do that. That's not building on each other's ideas. The idea here is more, if someone introduces an idea, that before I jump to something else, I really try to run with it for a while and to see what's in it, how much value we can get out of it before I introduce another thing. So it's not just a wrestling match about I want my idea to win. Addressing conflict timely, we've touched on this. This is a tough piece, and again, unless there is a culture that encourages it, that has regular check-ins, that has 360s, that creates a framework where people are used to doing this more regularly, it's hard because most people are conflict avoidant. So, and our current organizational realities make that even easier. So it's an important piece, and it needs specific attention. Discussing decision norms, I do find that a lot of organizations, as a matter of fact, sometimes I run just team retreats around decision effectiveness where people feel we're just not getting enough yield on our decision. We're not doing what we said we would be doing. It took us too long to get there. Too many people were involved. It's not quite clear where's the final say, or some people who feel they should have a say didn't have a say. So there is just lacking clarity about decision norms. And again, the result is lacking buy-in, half-hearted implementation of decisions. This gets even more complicated if you work in a larger organization and you make global or regional decisions that then have to be implemented on a functional or on a country level, and it just gets a mess. So again, there has to be clarity, and that takes time, and it has to be spelled out. It's work. It feels like it's more work, and it indeed is more work initially. It just saves you a lot of time and disagreement in the long run. Focusing on possibility has to do with the fact that in some teams, and a lot of us are used to this kind of discussion. People really just discuss problems that need to get fixed, things that aren't working, things that are broken, and high-performance teams are really they have a little bit of a different lens. They have a lens at what is it that wants to unfold, what is it that's possible, what's already working right now, and how can we make it work even better. It creates optimism. It really helps people get into a flow zone, and it's a very significant shift of the mindset that really helps teams reach much higher performance levels. We have managing thinking styles, which is basically creating and allowing cognitive diversity into a team. And again, that probably requires training, and it also requires a whole amount of self-awareness work. Reflecting the how of work, this is very much the slide I showed you earlier, but the important appeal to all of you, if you really want to make headway, if you feel you want to try some of these ideas here, unless you schedule explicit moments with your team to talk about the how of work, it's probably just going to get eaten up by the operational pressure to produce results, so that there is an immense need here to get things done. The using formal power sparingly, again, collaboration is a choice. People make it or people don't. They hold back. The use of formal power usually doesn't enable that choice. The best way to use formal power is, and that's coming back to the consensus with qualification, people want their leaders to make a decision if they feel they've had a due process in the decision making and the decision process is stuck. Sometimes leaders even wait too long, I find. That is a wonderful moment to use formal power, but other than that, it should ideally be a more consensus-driven process. Ensuring all voices, I touched on why that is important, and improving role clarity. Again, some of you, depending on your training backgrounds, you know, there are all kinds of models, RACI and DAISY and DECT and whatnot. They're all good. They all, you know, are contextually a little bit better here or there. But the point is to do it, and it's not a very thrilling task to do. So sometimes when I do it, I can see it's hard work. It's not exciting as much as thinking, you know, like brainstorming future possibilities, but it's tremendously important. The number one reason or the number one source of conflict in organizations is not interpersonal difference. This is or differences. This is sometimes something that people think, that the main cause of conflict in organizations is that people don't get along. The main source of conflict in organizations is that there is not enough clarity about roles and responsibilities, and then there's role-based conflict. And so cleaning up whatever work needs to get done in this area also really frees up a lot of resources and a lot of times to have the right kind of conflict that you want to have. So that gives you an idea. It also shows you that, you know, I hope, because really I don't want to be the person who says it's just one thing you have to focus on. It's a variety of things you need to get done. If you start the discussion around these issues, you will find probably also that you will have discussions about how you give each other feedback, and so forth. So there are a number of things, but you will get to some very solid and important conversations. And oops, I forgot to click. Just the final word here. Thank you. I'm happy to open questions. Sorry for going over. But the biggest takeaway here I really want to impart is high performance. There is no magic to high performance teams. You know, sometimes they just magically find, that's true. But for the most part, it's not that they have a secret knowledge of any kind. What they do is that they get insight about what they need to perform better, and they're not only getting that insight, they're acting on it. They have team members and a team leader who makes a commitment to really keep the ball rolling and stay at it, and that is what gets the results. And it is something that will take you more than a one-time team building effort. It is something that requires you to do regular team check-ins and so forth. But it is a possibility, and I would argue that every team, particularly teams who already describe themselves as average performing, can be much better and can live up much more to the potential that they see in themselves. It's just work, but it's very worthy work. And that will be my closing remark, Ali.
Well, thank you very much, Yosh, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we are open for question and answer. So if you have a question, you could either post it in the question box. I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf, or you could raise your hand, and I'll give you an opportunity to speak to Yosh directly. I see there are a couple of hands raised already, so let me go to the first caller. We have Najud Al-Sahli. Najud, can you hear us? Hello? Najud Al-Sahli, can you hear us? Najud, unfortunately we cannot hear you.
You might be able to type the question.
Yeah, you might be able to write the question, but I believe just went offline. And okay, Najud, are you back? Can you hear us? Najud Al-Sahli, can you hear us? Hello? Okay, let me move to the other caller. Let me see. We have Huda Kari. Huda, can you hear us? Hello, Huda. Okay, we had raised hands. Let me go to the question box now. There's a question from Mark Stora. What are the key points to gain insight about the performance of the team?
What are the key points to gain insight?
Yeah, gain insight about the performance of the team.
Well, I'm not sure. I just want to make sure I really understand the question. Is that about what are main things I should pay attention to measure the performance level of a team?
Well, Mark wrote. Let me try to see if I can unmute Mike and if he can.
Or
speak.
I can answer it as if that was the question. And if I didn't get it, then I apologize.
Yeah. Let me see. Mark, can you hear us? I just unmuted you. You're regarding your question. Hi, Mark. You there? Well, okay. Let me see. I mean, again, yes. Your last page. He just wrote your last page where he wrote about the insight. I think what are the key points to gain insight about the performance of the team?
Okay. So basically, those insights, they have to do with the 12 characteristics that I just presented. So they know, actually, they have, for instance, the social wherewithal to realize, you know what, there are some conversations we've been avoiding here for a while. And they don't need necessarily an external consultant for that or an enlightened team leader. They get it on their own, and then they actually say, you know what, I know I really don't want to have that conversation, but I will, and I will make sure I schedule it. So that's one thing. Or they realize, hey, wait a while, we've been talking here, and the only person who's been talking is Yosh. Like, why aren't we hearing more of the other voices? So they self-regulate around that. It really has a lot to do with team members' ability to realize, do we need more clarity in regards to roles and responsibilities? Is this a conflict that's based in ambiguous roles, or is that a conflict that's based in an ill-defined goal? So they do have a lot of the social awareness, and they do have the courage to address it constructively and have a conversation that is really leading to some kind of actionable agreement. So that's what I would like to say about that.
Okay, Najud has just mentioned that his connection is good, so let me go back. Najud, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, could you please introduce yourself and ask the questions? And I understand you have a couple of questions, so please go one by one, quickly.
Yes, okay. I'm Najud Al-Sahli. Actually, thanks a lot for your presentation. And my questions are depending on my situation, my job as an executive manager. If I set actually a goal, like a common goal, like increasing the productivity, and I chose one idea among 5 ideas, won't you think that this will get the others get offended or no? The second question is, some of us were born like followers, not leaders. So if I have followers in my company and I want them to be leaders, I want them to be highly motivated while I do all I can to motivate them, but they are followers. They were born like that and they don't want to change. How can I change them to be leaders one day? And how to deal with a highly motivated employee that just gets to you and tell ideas all the day, all the time, and you want to slow him down and just to tell them, it's fine, it's okay, just calm down and we're going to do everything by time.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm counting 3 questions. The first one about the goal around increasing productivity that you have.
Yeah.
So when I think you mentioned, you said there were 5 options, and so that's already a great thing. Most of the time, the way this works is that someone says, let's do it this way, and then everyone else is trying to take down the idea. Oh, well, have you thought about this? Or why not that? So the idea is really to break up your decision making. That's again, this is all about how to buy into the final scenario that you wanted to select. So to really give people a chance to realize this is how we looked at the problem. Are we in agreement at how we are looking at it? We're not talking about final decision yet. And when people are like, okay, that's exactly how that's exactly what the process is or the problem is. And then to see, okay, here are the 5 options. Is this a reasonable selection of options that we have. Again, we're not selecting one yet, and then again you draw people into a consensus mode around those 5 options and the pros and cons that come with each, and then ultimately say, so now we have to make a decision, you know, what are the criteria, and so you basically you build consensus step by step around the framing, about the options, and then about the final choice. What often happens is that all of this, because people feel pressured to do this quickly, is they just say, here's the final, you know, like these were the scenarios, but they're not really explained, or, you know, like we had different ideas, but here's what we thought is best. And that is usually a difficult way to get more buy-in. So that would be my response to question number 1. Question number 2, I personally, I mean, this is probably a longer discussion about are people born followers or born leaders, but let's just say at any given moment, not everyone is a leader at a given moment. Maybe one day they can, and that's not a debate we have to have. But if you're confronted with an employee who just doesn't seem to have it, usually there is some kind of growth or maturing curve to that. People get better in around some kind of technical competency that they have, and they need that to build confidence that they even can be a leader. And then there is a moment where they really go from technical expert and individual contributor to usually leading others, and then at some stage they lead not others, but they're a manager of managers, and then they manage functions. So there is some kind of progression, and it would be your job to see, you know, is this person even interested in making a gradual stretch to the next level. So if they're an individual contributor, would they be interested in being a project manager, and so forth. So they actually can do, you know, you present a scenario for their growth as a leader that doesn't feel too scary, if indeed you're really motivated to and think that this person has the potential for more. If they ultimately think that they're not a leader, then, you know, that's a tough nut to crack, because that's going to get very psychological, and I would argue that this is usually so personal that there's very little that we can do in a work environment as a boss of a person who has a very strong sense of self-identity around what they can or cannot do. So if you have a choice there to not try to promote someone who can't be a leader or is fearful about it, not just be doubtful every once in a while, but literally just says, I don't think ever I can do that, then I would limit my efforts to convince that person. And the scenario with the person who has so many ideas, what you can do is really be very clear about saying what it is that you need. Is that a moment where you need more ideas, or are you in a place of your decision or problem-solving cycle where you say, you know, at this stage we're actually not needing more ideas, we're needing to limit the ideas that we already have, or we need to do some scenario planning to make it real. So to inform the person that obviously they have he or she has a natural preference there to generating ever more solutions, but there may be a moment where you say, you know what, this is really great, but at this stage we're really in a different part of the problem-solving cycle. So you can help bring awareness to that preference of this person to generate ever more ideas, because at some stage what you need is action and not more ideas, and you may have to educate that person more around it. I hope that these answers are helpful. Yeah.
Yes, but for the last question, just one point. I don't want to stop him at the moment for one reason. I don't want him to stop thinking or stop giving me ideas. Well, like, his ideas are really, really great. But at the moment, I can't go for not spending too much cost on me. I can't develop and enlarge the work environment for now. Okay. So I just would like to postpone it, but in a very good way, that he will keep being motivated, but without stopping.
Yeah, so well, first of all, I think it's very important to say that exactly the way you've shared it, and at the same time stay firm at the commitment you make. So if only, you know, if what you have is 30 minutes or an hour a week to be open to this flood of wonderful ideas, then I would say that very clearly. And I would, you know, possibly what you can also do is see if there are other partners that your staff member can use to validate their ideas. So you're starting to get already a validated and minimized selection of all these ideas and not just the entire flood of them. So there are different ways to handle it, but by all means,
okay, thank you so much.
Be transparent about your appreciation of those ideas and your need to limit that. You have only limited bandwidth right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
So true. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions. Let me move to a question box. We have a couple of more questions. There's one from Brother Usman Arakzai. The question is, for collaborative coaching, should we differentiate between government and private-owned organizations?
From my personal experience, yes. And the main reason I would, this is not that I'm quoting any kind of data or so. This is just really anecdotal based on having worked with large non-governmental organizations in different parts of the world. I do find that, and literally without exception, that large non-governmental or governmental organizations are organized in a more hierarchical and structured way. And that is something that, whether we like it or not, it's just something we have to take into consideration because it's a reality. And it means that decision-making will be more formalized, that there is a lot more organizational politicking that happens, that there are a lot more back-channel conversations that happens where people try to influence, the meeting agenda and what the options are. And I've been in those scenarios. I've seen sometimes, like down to people planting contributions from a large audience. So like I'm sure you've seen some of that. So if in a more formalized hierarchical organization, all of that becomes more important, and it hinders performance. The reality that a lot of our governmental and non-governmental organizations, unfortunately, I must say, aren't living up to the better performance standards of the better for-profit companies is, among others, for that reason. So, but again, we just have to address that. So that means there's probably a lot of more informal conversation that needs to happen, and it just takes a lot of patience to find the right decision makers and sponsors who say this is really something that our culture needs, and then to slowly start introducing that. And the best, most effective way I've seen organizations do it is not by trying to change their entire culture, because that's literally impossible and usually a very frustrating exercise, but to look into your organization and see like what's the most promising island, so to speak, what's the most promising part of the organization where I feel I have a chance of changing culture, where I have a chance of getting more of the things that I presented during that webinar, and then build the case from there. But yes, there is a difference.
Okay, thank you. We have another caller, so let me move directly to the caller, Dr. Muhammad Rishad. Doctor, could you please introduce yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dr. Muhammad Rishad Faridi, and I'm assistant professor at one of the government universities in Saudi Arabia. And my question is, in fact, it's not a question, it's a comment. Like we teach a lot of collaborative to students, and we try to practice also. But I somehow have broken collaborative into three steps. The very first step is what we call as coordination. I just tell the task, like let's have an early stage planning, like formulate, integrate, and then after that we have a little bit more seriousness, and then we think about it's more cooperative by a relationship which tends to improve our seriousness of formulation of teams, participative decision making, etc. And then after that, I tell them that automatically it will be the collaborative approach where we'll be having more seriousness, and where there will be predetermined goals to be achieved, and the relationship will be more stronger, and there will be more win-win approach concept of sharing. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much for your comment. Any further comments that you would like to make, Yosh, on it?
No, I mean it really, again, I think there is an element of coordination, and I'm fully in agreement. I think that's true. And then as interdependence grows, you just need all these relational aspects, and those harder to find aspects become more and more important, and that indeed requires clarity about, is the problem I'm looking at here, is that something that can be solved by coordinating better? And if so, that's nice, because it's a kind of like an easier problem to deal with. But the more creative or more rewarding problems these days have a high degree of interdependence, and then the things that my colleague just mentioned indeed become more important. So I do feel I'm in agreement. And at the end of the day, there are so many frameworks. The most important thing is that whoever works on it has some kind of clarity about how they want to approach, how they want to assess the situation, and how they want to approach it. And I've said before, I do think that there are different ways to describe the same problem, and it seems like you have found something that works for you. So that's wonderful.
Very much, Dr. Mohammed, for sharing your inputs also. So let me move to another question from Brother Abdul Aziz. The question is, how do you pull along with team members who might be lacking with an overall teamwork spirit, but are valuable members in their own way? For example, the special quality teams.
Yeah, I think this is one of the ultimate questions, and thank you for bringing this up. I must say, every year I have at least a handful of, like in my coaching assignments, of leaders who wonder what they do about a team member who exactly is described by your scenario. I do find that the more high-performing organizations that I have or had the privilege to work with, that they're actually very clear and say that there is a moment where it doesn't matter how great that person is. If they're not playing along, if for some reason, for instance, they're just focusing on their own functions needs rather than the bigger organization's goals, or if they have a very strained relationship with a colleague with whom they have to collaborate. I've seen leaders ultimately say, if you don't get this settled, if you don't straighten this up, you have no future here. And not everyone has the courage to do it, and it's a painful thing. I think in the long run it works better. And also, this goes back to this one game theory slide on how do you collaborate with a non-collaborator. I do find that cultures that have very strong rules around what their culture is. If you, for instance, take Zappos, which is an extremely successful example of creating a retail organization, or even Google, there are a whole bunch of organizations. W.L. Gore, for instance, who does Gore-Tex and so forth. They're very clear about, like, this is who we are, this is how we do things, and if that doesn't work for you, it doesn't matter how great you are, because at the end of the day, it will come to cost us. And on the reverse side, I must say, some of the financial firms I've worked with who do have a culture of saying, all I care is your performance numbers, and even if you are very abrasive to others, that in the long run it does cost them as well. It means that other talent might leave. It means that they end up in lawsuits in extreme cases, and I've seen those cases. So I would encourage you to send the message loud and clear and say, these are my expectations, this is how we do it here, here's a timeline for you to change your behaviors, possibly get support for this person. Behavior change is really, really hard, but I have seen that if the leaders say to an employee, you've got to get this done or else, that really builds the motivation for people to improve it. If they lack that message, people will just continue to act out of their own preferences. It's just too strong human nature.
Well, thank you very much. And before we conclude, Yosh, people are asking, what should we actually write on the Google, which you mentioned on the search engine, about IBM yearlies? Could you just...
Oh, it's called IBM Global CEO Study, like Chief Executive Officer, okay. And you will probably see results for every year, like 20. They do it every year, and
IBM
also
IBM Global CEO Study.
CEO Study, yeah.
Global CEO Study. Okay, folks, I'm just broadcasting this on on the chat box, so you will know exactly what to type. IBM Global CEO Study.
And as I said, they also have, there is a global marketing officer, global financial officer study. They do this, and I think they call it overall their global C-suite studies. Once you land on one of their links, then they usually link out to the other reports. They're extremely informative. They interview, for instance, for the CEO study, I think like 1,200 global CEOs from all continents, and it's done very, very nicely. It's amazing that they make this available for free.
Well, thank you very much for sharing, and that really brings us towards the end of the webinar, folks. I would like to thank you, Yosh, for a very wonderful presentation. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
I only want to reiterate my point that the rewards are amazing, but the effort to get there also is kind of amazing. So it's a wonderful journey to do, and it takes really the right motivation to deal with a lot of very interdependent issues. But the rewards, when we look at those high-performing organizations, we can see how powerful the rewards are. So I just want to be encouraging of us doing this, because it's a very worthy quest, but it is work. That's an important piece about it. Let's not fool ourselves. It is work to do, and it's worth it. And
once again,
so thank you everyone for listening, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yosh. Especially I would like to thank you on behalf of MILE for taking the time to share this presentation and valuable inputs with all of us. And thank you all of those who participated and for posing the questions and making it an interactive experience for all of us. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on MILE community, which is community.mile.org. So please stay tuned to the community to access the recorded version, which will be uploaded in the next couple of days, and you will be able to download the soft copy of the presentation, which Yosh will be sharing with us, and we will upload on our MILE community. Once again, Yosh, thank you very much, and thank you all of those who participated. I'm going to end this webinar, so you all will be automatically dismissed out. You all have a good day, good evening.